Hello and welcome to the Periphery. I'm Alan Elrod, and I'm joined today by Dr. Kevin Barron to do another one of our episodes going through our 50 Takes on Democracy series. Dr. Barron is an assistant professor of political science and public management at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. His research focuses on American political institutions, examining power struggles between the president and Congress over issues of access to information, executive privilege, and the Freedom of Information Act. And his first book, Presidential Privilege and the Freedom of Information Act, was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2019 as a part of their series, New Perspectives on the American Presidency. And for our purposes, Dr. Barron is the author of the Tennessee entry in our 50 Takes series, which is titled Cultivating Anti-Democratic Tendencies in Tennessee. And Kevin, as we kick off, what I want to kind of ask you to do is talk broadly about one of the kind of key pillars of this piece, which is the emergence of some pretty, I think we would consider to be not just somewhat anti-democratic, but also somewhat liberal bills in the Tennessee state legislature and policies pushed by Governor Bill Lee, bills that target reproductive freedom, but also bills that target things like LGBTQ rights. And as has become pretty popular in the South and across a lot of the United States, bills that target curriculum, in particularly anti-critical race theory, such as it is, right? Content. So go ahead and kick us off. And I'm excited to get into all of these different sort of little avenues and cul-de-sacs with you.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Ellen. I really appreciate the opportunity, both to write the piece for the 50 takes. It's been a fascinating series, and I'm very grateful to be a part of it because I keep reading every time one of the new entries come in. It's interesting to see what's going on and sort of the commonalities and differences across the states. So yeah, Tennessee is a fascinating place to be, both in the good and the bad. So as you kind of kicked us off, obviously following both national trends as well as, I want to point out, Tennessee doesn't often get the credit it should, especially for Governor Bill Lee. Oftentimes Tennessee gets overshadowed by Florida and Texas, who passed similar bills that first passed in Tennessee. So for example, Tennessee was first to pass a bill that rolled back permitted concealed carry for guns. So Bill Lee actually in 2018, when he was running for governor, campaigned that he would not sign that bill into law. And then a few years later, he signs that bill into law. So for example, in Tennessee, anybody can carry a gun, open or concealed, permitless, without needing any kind of training or any of that, and did it before Texas and before some of the other states that passed those laws. So in some ways, Tennessee is trying to be a trendsetter of these issues. In others, it's always kind of been there. So obviously, when the Dobbs decision was handed down, Tennessee had a trigger law already in effect on women's reproductive rights. So that bill had passed a number of years ago and was just waiting there for that opportunity for when Roe was overturned. So 30 days after the Dobbs decision handed down, of course, essentially a full outright ban on abortions in the state went into effect. And that's been pretty par for the course for the state for a very long time. Other bills, of course, actually, here's a great one. So 2 days after the 2022 midterm election, the first bill filed for the what we're getting ready to kick off our legislative session here in late January. But members of the legislature could already start filing bills for the 2023 session. So right after the election, the very first bill filed was a bill to criminalize drag shows in the state. So it would outlaw drag shows completely. It would make it a crime for them to happen, for you to attend one. Like, with everything that's been going on, and to put, I guess, some context into this as well, Tennessee ranks at the bottom grouping of states when it comes to money spent per pupil on education. Tennessee ranks at the bottom when it comes to healthcare. Tennessee ranks at the bottom when it comes to pay and salaries per capita on average. Tennessee ranks toward the top per capita on gun violence and homicide. So it's a state that is severely lacking in a lot of the basics that I think most citizens have expectations, at least to a certain degree, of state government to follow through on. So things like infrastructure, healthcare, education, sort of basics of standards of living that don't often get fulfilled. And instead, we end up with this focus on culture war. So over the last 2 years, especially, and I'm sure we'll see it again in the upcoming session, there have been a series of anti-trans bills being pushed. So the athlete bills, bathroom bills, things like that are always really popular here. You mentioned curriculum last year during the legislative session. They passed a divisive concepts bill targeting specifically higher education. So in 2021, the Tennessee legislature passed a bill that was targeting K-12 education on divisive concepts. So this was teaching racism. It was teaching critical, anything that I have to air quote the critical race theory, because what critical race theory is versus the talking point of it are two completely different things. So last year, though, in 2022, this divisive topics bill comes in. So, for example, I teach regularly American national government. It's that lower division gen ed course that all students have to take. And according to the law now that is in place in Tennessee, I cannot teach topics around power, that there are power hierarchies, for example, in America, which, interestingly enough, when you teach American history, look at the Constitution as it was ratified in 1789, it creates a hierarchy of power because most people are locked out completely from citizenship rights. Now, obviously, that's changed over time, but at the same time, to be forced to have to ignore history or ignore contentious issues of debate is not healthy, which of course gets into some of the bigger problems that face the state as well when we think about things like civic health. But these are just some of the pieces that we continue to see, though, where the legislature and state government is dominated by the Republican Party. They are a majority within the state. And there's a lot more variation within the Republican Party in Tennessee, although the majority of the majority do lean more to the far right than they do toward the center. Democrats in the state legislature, both the House and the Senate, only hold a handful of seats. So the Republicans do have a supermajority. They do not need the Democrats to get anything done, which can be problematic for, of course, any democratic governance, because you're losing some of those checks and balances that we would like to see in the system, because the minority party essentially has zero power to influence much of what goes on in Nashville. The governor's office and all the executive offices, of course, are also controlled by Republicans outright. So we don't have a Democrat doesn't hold a statewide seat at any level. And so it creates a very skewed system, one that of late prizes those kind of culture war issues over more of those bread and butter issues I mentioned a few minutes ago.
So that's an excellent overview. I kind of want to peg something in all of that, which is, you talked about how Tennessee actually has been a bit of an innovator, actually, not a follower, but a leader on some of this stuff, right? Florida and Texas get the headlines. for a lot of obvious reasons in terms of their size and sort of maybe the
Sure.
flair of their governors versus Tennessee's. But yeah, I'm interested, especially the way your piece talks about civic life. I think this is really
Mhm.
important, which is we have to, I think not, a lot of these conversations and pieces focus very appropriately on structures. And we're going to have a lot of those conversations about, electoral systems, local offices, actual, reforms to sort of like legal power at the local level, et cetera, right? Things that have to do with actual sort of structural elements of democracy.
Mhm.
But there's also this, I think, very important component, right? Which is just sort of what is civic life like? Is it rich? Is it one that values pluralism in a kind of general sense, right? You can even have like a relatively conservative civic culture that is still pluralist, right? I mean, it
Oh,
doesn't,
sure.
those things are not, so we're not saying, everywhere that isn't kind of like San Francisco is, illiberal. We're saying that now, the questions I think that come up is, something like criminalizing drag performances.
Right.
Ask you to do something I think academics are wary of doing, which is play the pundit a little bit. But living in Tennessee and in Middle Tennessee, you know, these kinds of bills tend, I think, to get uh, usually they get a lot of applause from the people who really like it, sort of the hardliners. They get some pushback from the activists, and then a lot of times there's a large, I don't want to call it a middle, but there's a large swath of people who just don't pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how this debate around I hesitate to call it debate, really this sort of scaremongering campaign, right, around drag performers and LGBTQ people. Uh,
Mhm.
Obviously, for someone to even feel comfortable putting forward a bill that says not just sort of like, we're not comfortable with these and certain, but we want to criminalize it, right? The culture on the ground has to have gotten pretty hostile. So, like, what is, I guess, in that context, the how has this landed? What is the sort of broader public discourse around this stuff and the treatment of these particular groups in Tennessee right now?
Sure. No, and that's a great question. And actually, I do want to just piggyback for a second off of a great point that you made. When we talk about democratic health and we talk about a pluralistic society and what that means, it is not mutually exclusive to any necessarily particular ideology, at least when we think about what both mainstream conservatism and liberalism has been in America, which are generally the two main ideologies of American politics. Of course, you've got extremists to the sides that have always existed there in one form or another over time. But generally, most Americans, when we look not just at those holding elected office, but most citizens, people who live here, tend to kind of group still toward the center overall. But that center is encapsulated, though, largely by liberalism and conservatism. And so you can have very vibrant pluralistic democracy and democratic health in any of those environments. And in fact, I would say having that a healthy democratic environment is a place where you've got multiple perspectives and ideologies at play, where we can have those kinds of healthy debates going on. To the point that with the question that you were asking, I would say my take in Tennessee is that Tennessee civic health isn't good, and especially over the last number of years. Again, I think larger trends are it's always been this way. It's gotten worse of late, in part as our politics have become more divisive. We're losing in many ways that sense of I may not agree with it, but yeah, as you pointed out, like drag shows, to criminalize that, to move to the place where we're now trying to pass laws that because I don't like or disagree with um, that lifestyle perspective, who you are, who somebody is, to make that illegal. That is using government in a whole different manner. And one thing that's come far more to the front or to the forefront of the Trump era has been this very vitriolic political sense of, it's okay to be as kind of in your face, compromise is bad and weak, or somehow it's weak. And that, I don't have to put up with anything that I disagree with. There, of course, is all of this underlying hypocrisy that exists within that, because, of course, anybody who's trying to make an argument that some particular group should lose their rights, often these are the same folks that are making arguments about how they feel their rights are being trampled all over. And so it almost, I don't know what we would call it, almost it's like this revenge type mentality, which is, we've reverted to a more zero sum form of politics. And I see this a lot in Tennessee, where it used to be that politics isn't zero sum, right? That, there are struggles and disagreements over policy, different areas, and we might not ever agree on certain things, but it's okay, because you have the ability to have your beliefs and perspectives, and I have the right to have mine. And lately it's become far more of this, there's something wrong with you because you do this and you disagree. And because I don't like you or your lifestyle or your perspective or the group that you identify with, that this is a bad thing, and I need to stop this bad thing from happening. And so it's a lot of negative feedback going on at the same time. Politicians, of course, play into this a lot, because it reinforces, voter divides, and it shores up the bases that they want to ensure that they get reelected or get elected. Tennessee is also obviously in the South. It's part of the Bible Belt. There's a strong religiosity in the state. So you do have a lot of evangelical voters. You have a lot of people with very strong religious, Christian religious convictions that, especially when it comes to LGBTQ rights, those have been consistently demonized by these groups for quite some time. You also see, Tennessee's got, I won't state his name. There's a very well-known preacher in the Nashville area, holds book burnings, is very political, but is very extreme in much of this kind of revivalistic, fire and brimstone preaching that he engages in. And it is far more extreme, I would say, than a lot of what we would consider the norm to be. And
I'm
so,
curious, are you
yeah,
talking about Greg Locke?
yeah, I
Okay.
am.
Sorry, I noticed his name, but I wanted to actually, that leads me to a question, a kind
Oh,
of
sure.
multi-part question here, which is, one, I'm curious. We talk a lot, and very importantly, about the nationalization of all this stuff, right? And there are all the big national institutions, media, Fox, Internet, Daily Wire, Twitter, and then all the big advocacy places that drive this stuff. But I'm curious, what are the contours of the kind of dynamics within Tennessee's institutions? The places like the Tennessean, the reporting and the editorialism that's happening there, the big news outlets, and even also, as you've mentioned, Nashville is home to some large, both secular and religious affiliated academic
Sure.
institutions, right? Both some big evangelical and also even is home to some administrative headquarters for some churches, right? In
Mm-hmm.
terms of that. So I'm curious how those institutions are interacting with some of these debates, either pushing, like maybe whether they're pushing strongly for some of these reforms, whether they're kind of maybe trying to take a hands-off approach, and then I guess the sort of, whether it's a second part or sort of subsection to that question is, are the people who are like Greg Locke in Tennessee at this point part of that establishment ecosystem, or are they still considered kind of outsiders to that?
That's a great question. The second part of that is well, they're both great questions. Okay, let me try to tackle the first one first, and we'll kind of go in order from there. From what I can see, Tennessee is perhaps in many ways is reflective in some ways that we would see in other states of grappling with modernization. Much of the state is still rural. So outside of the main city, I mean, you have Memphis, you have Nashville, both big cities. The bulk, I mean, between those two cities alone, and I should say between those two metropolitan areas alone, you pretty much have almost half the state's population. But a lot of the state is very rural. I mean, we still have, for example, I mean, there are tons of counties in Tennessee that don't have high speed internet access, right? Like you're still on dial up internet. And so we talk about like, especially things like press, for example. So even access to information can be really difficult in many places. Now, you mentioned the Tennessean. The Tennessean, biggest newspaper in the state, Clarksville, where I am, has the Leaf Chronicle, which essentially today is part of the Tennessean, which is all owned by USA Today. So when it comes to newspapers in Tennessee, we've lost, for the most part, local press. Now, of course, USA Today still has, the Tennessean still has reporters here in Tennessee. I mean, the Leaf Chronicle really has one Montgomery County based reporter. And then the rest are out of Nashville, essentially. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. USA Today tends to be a bit more conservative if you're looking editorially speaking, as far as that goes. But you know, in your big metropolitan area, so Memphis, Nashville, you do run and have a host of television news outlets. You have NPR, for example. You have a lot of talk radio, which again in Tennessee I think it's all right wing or more Republican conservative centric talk radio as far as that goes. And so access to information is very unequal. And that, of course, can create a lot of issues in and of itself. Institutionally speaking, again, it gets back to this idea. I think there's a mix here. When we look at the legislature, and I very inarticulately tried to say it earlier, so maybe I can articulate it a little better here. The Republican supermajority in the legislature really runs from more centrist, what we would consider a centrist Republican, to the kind of far right. We had representatives, legislators who 2 years ago today stormed the Capitol on January 6th and were part of that group. So, I mean, you've got the kind of anti-democratic, very authoritarian types through to far more moderate, pragmatic, who are looking at a state saying, hey, economically, we could be doing better. We need to focus on more infrastructure. So thinking about a lot of the basics that the state needs that we've been falling or have always been behind on, that are in some ways kind of preventing. So when you mention different institutions, thinking about religious groups, thinking about, I mean, even educational institutions, corporate headquarters and companies that have that do a lot of business in the state, they're all involved in some ways. I think in that sense, especially economically, the discourse is far more productive. People tend to be more pragmatic. They tend to be willing to sit down and negotiate and look at bigger pictures down to minute policy details and try to get things done. Where the problem comes is when that type of kind of consistent pragmatic lawmaking and engagement meets the culture war dominance that, of course, as you mentioned, kind of makes its way around, especially social media. And if you're listening to a lot of talk radio, I mean, this is the stuff that talk radio is made of. This is also, pick your cable news network of favor. So the late night pundit shows on those networks, or I should say the evening pundit shows, right? They have their news programming and then they have the talk shows, and it's, most people tune into the talk shows. So they like the punditry. So it's those echo chambers of the culture war stuff, which gets dominance. And so we're having this fight in the state between the culture warriors using this to satiate the base, to maintain power and hold their positions, meets the real pragmatic needs and demands. So on the ground, if I were to talk to, and I have these debates with students in class pretty regularly, and of course, being in Clarksville, I have students who run the gamut in political ideology. So pretty much, pick your spot on that spectrum. I've got students in class, but a lot of we come to agreement on a lot of different issues when we kind of push the culture warrior stuff aside and focus around what do we see as important in the state, what is needed. So, I mean, even things from education. So we were talking about that divisive concepts bill. So even for a lot of conservatives and a lot of Republicans in the state, they don't like that kind of legislation. They're not in favor of it, or weren't necessarily in favor of it to begin with, but it met a political need during an election cycle where the governor was up for reelection, where a lot of the legislators were up for reelection, and saw it as a good tool for that voter base that tends to show up. I do have to mention too, because I talked about it in the piece as well. Tennessee tends to be toward the bottom on voter turnout. So, and Tennessee over the last 20 years is actually trending downward on voter turnout, which is the opposite of what we're seeing in a lot of other states, where states, especially over the last 2 or 3 election cycles, you've seen an increase in voter turnout. Tennessee is trending downwards now, and has been since the 2000 election. So it's kind of curious to see that voter turnout continues to drop, which means, of course, it tends to be the people who show up to vote tend to be far more of your solid partisans. And if we look, I'll just use the 2020 election data, since it's the most recent. Trump versus Biden, we can say reasonably Tennessee is about 2/3 solidly Republican, 1/3 Democratic, if we just kind of run with that trend. So that holds across most of the regions of the state, as well as when we look at the statewide totals. The margin of difference, for example, voter turnout differences for Clarksville versus Chattanooga or Knoxville or even Memphis and Nashville are still pretty close. Although, of course, local government is more diverse than state government. So to tie in your second question, you mentioned Locke and kind of that brand of, I don't even know. I mean, I guess it's activism in a sense. I struggle. I understand that it's a religious group and that you're talking about religious belief systems, but to me, it speaks far more of activism, political activism, than of religion. I
No,
don't
I
think
mean,
even
I
the
grew up in Southern evangelical Christianity, and I don't think it's inappropriate at all to put Locke in the activist category at all. I think it's
yeah,
inappropriate.
yeah. I mean, I don't think he's mainstream by any means. I mean, sure, you may have a few legislators that may agree with him on occasion, but I don't see that as especially if you're looking at most voters in the state. He's far from mainstream. He is seen as an extremist. There is more of that here, for example, than I've experienced in other places that I've lived, even other places in the South. But I don't see that type of politics. Actually, I may need to retract what I was going through my head. Um, Generally speaking, folks like that are not of the mainstream. I mean, we did have a legislator this last session last year call for not just books to be banned, but to be burned. But by no means was that a popular take. I mean, book banning more popular, book burning not popular.
What was the kind of popular response to that?
Um, well, it's a lot of it gets back into the idea of, well, we need to protect the children. Um, and so, look, kids are always a great excuse for needing to do this. And so you end up losing where the actual kind of debates or discussion should be, into these fallback kind of talking points. And again, much of the anti-LGBT policies that we see being pushed at all levels are wrapped up in this, we're protecting kids. But there's no real sense that you're understanding kids, not to mention the real sense of what about LGBTQ kids? What about trans kids in Tennessee? What about kids that are being told that you're less than, that you don't count, you don't matter, you shouldn't be allowed to participate in sports or in groups? I mean, books for me, look, we probably agree on this, academic in nature, right? We love books. I can see a bookshelf right behind you that's got tons of books on there. Books are a great way for us to not just learn, but to experience the world through different perspectives. One thing that's important, especially for kids, is seeing themselves in books, right? And when we get into these debates about school libraries, public libraries, what books are there, what we should remove from the shelves because people don't like seeing that there's a gay couple in a book, or they don't like that the main character is trans or identifies as a gender that they were not born with. That this is somehow aberrant and dangerous is ridiculous. And I find it very irksome that many fall back into that argument, which is very mainstream here, that this is a way that we're doing it for the kids. And it's really showing, I think, a lot of disconnect. The Moms for Liberty group is a great example, considering the woman that founded that group in Tennessee doesn't even have kids in public schools, yet she is out there screaming about what kind of books can be available to kids in public schools.
I was wondering actually, because I had another question, but I'm going to put it on pause for a second.
Okay.
It flows in with this conversation around schools. Can you, I'm very familiar with it because we have friends who live there. Can you dive in a little bit, maybe for listeners, to the kind of specifics of Williamson County and Brentwood, Tennessee, and the place where a lot of this kind of emerged, right? Because I think there are people who may not really understand the sort of specific place of Brentwood and Williamson County within Tennessee politics, but also even just within the Nashville metro.
So I will say up front, I am no expert in this, and you probably actually have probably a better take on it than I. But I mean, some background. So this area, or part of now Nashville, or the Nashville metropolitan area. I mean, Williamson County is one of the most sorry, I'm losing the term. Income inequality. That is in the country. Williamson County has one of the greatest divides of income inequality that we have seen. So you have a very wealthy part of the Nashville area and suburb that meets also a very poor part of the Nashville area, and it's this kind of area there. This area has always been kind of a hotbed of that culture war conservatism, at least as far as I'm aware, for quite some time. And so it brings this very, in some ways it's different perhaps than more, even whatever we would consider kind of the mainstream of conservatism in Tennessee today to be. It's a bit more to the extreme side of it. And so you get this. All right, I'm just going to say it. So racism, of course, plays an underlying role here. When we talk about the income inequality divides, of course, the low income areas around Nashville are heavily people of color, where the very wealthy areas are predominantly white. Bill Lee is from Williamson County. He actually did a campaign event last year, before the election. This was actually just about a year ago, where he, with a nonprofit organization that provides shoes to school kids. And there was a school in Williamson County. Of course, it was in a very low income area. The students there predominantly were Black. And Bill Lee and his wife showed up with the day that this nonprofit showed up with a brand new pair of shoes for every student at the school. That's what they were providing. And so Lee shows up, and part of his shtick while he's there, it should be pretty easy. He hands out some shoes. He gets a few pictures taken with the kids. Hey, look at the great things we're doing here. He decides that he's going to wash kids' feet, just as Jesus did, and actually did that, where there was a group of kids who they brought in a bucket of water and he washed their feet, and he made this big deal out of it. And it came across as, I know for some probably loved it and thought this was really great. It came across as very strange, a bit creepy. Uh, but I bring this up to say it's a good example of this kind of ideas of this paternalistic view that in many ways is grounded in racist ideas. So it's this idea that, Bill Lee is there with a bunch of poor black kids, saving them and washing their feet because he's just like Jesus and this needs to be done, rather than, look at the guy's budget on education. Like, if you cared about what you were doing, like, you could help this school way more than providing a pair of shoes. Or, that wasn't even him, that was a nonprofit group, but washing kids' feet, but it was this view, this very, I guess it's paternalistic in some sense, but it's also, it's creepily grounded in old racist ideas that you have to take care of these folks because they don't know any better, they can't do any better, and I need to step in and be the savior here. And it's kind of gross.
So that, I have a follow-up question that gets actually more into the weeds on school funding, but before, I said I grew up in evangelical kind of fundamentalist Christianity. We had youth retreats that we would do, that were these like leadership. It was like all the kind of the kids who were kind of like the most active youth group members from the churches in my town, and we'd have like an annual thing. It was like a leadership thing. And one of the things we would do as a youth group is there was a day where we washed each other's feet.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that was that. As soon as you said that, I was like, oh, I know that. I know that. I know that ritual so well.
Yeah.
Of foot washing. Man, I did not know that happened, but like as soon as you said it, I was like, oh, I'm deeply familiar with what this scene would have looked like.
Yeah.
This gets into actually something that I think is also a challenge, right? We're talking about, obviously education is a critical aspect of public life and civic life. And that tinge of religiosity you've been talking about this whole time, which again, the idea that religion plays a role in public life, very common throughout lots of places, and in fact, has in many instances played a role in fostering quite liberal and pluralist principles, right? But
absolutely,
obviously, in this case, we're looking in a different direction. This sort of failed-ish attempt to launch a partnership with Hillsdale, the conservative Christian school out of the Midwest, right? That basically this idea that Hillsdale was going to come in and through their sort of charter arm of their organization, partner with Tennessee schools. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that also really gets at the crux of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good one. I had almost completely forgotten about it until you said Hillsdale. So one of Bill Lee's big campaign planks for his reelection was school choice. Again, this is an issue you see in a lot of states. Kind of the idea that we should be using public education funds for private or charter schools, many through private for-profit companies, not all. Again, it's a mixed bag, and we don't need to delve too deep there, but Hillsdale specific. So Bill Lee is really tight with the president of Hillsdale College, which is an evangelical-based education company out of Michigan. They have ties to the DeVos family, is the former Secretary of Education in the Trump administration. Betsy DeVos, I believe, is still on the board of that company. And so they were the centerpiece for Governor Lee in making this campaign promise that he wanted 100 Hillsdale charter schools in Tennessee essentially by the time his governorship is over. That was one of his big pushes. Now Hillsdale advertises their curriculum as being conservative and evangelical based, especially around civics curriculum. And this was something last year, no, excuse me, in yeah, I guess it was last year, in Bill Lee's State of the State speech. He focused a lot on civics and civics education. And actually, in partnership with the governor's office, they just opened a center for civics education at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. But
I feel like I should pop in and say, right, like Hillsdale, even also, despite being quite small and not all that old, does have some incredibly prominent alumni amongst the sort of conservative evangelical world, right? Eric Prince, Betsy DeVos's brother,
sure.
Right, and it has both amongst its alumni, right, and sort of people who've become associated with it either through donating, right, or through some sorts of fellowships with its institutions, have some serious clout.
Oh yeah, for sure. So they became very central then for not just Bill Lee's reelection, but to his education plan. So, thinking about what, especially as he was looking at another 4-year term as governor, what his education plan, and it was centered around using Hillsdale, bringing them into Tennessee. He did an event a few months back with the president of Hillsdale. I think his name's Arn, Larry Arn, where in Tennessee. Now, this was a closed door event. It was a event with Bill Lee and Hillsdale's president. It was not open to the public. It was not open to the press, but somebody leaked videotape of Hillsdale's president essentially bad mouthing both education and Tennessee teachers. In fact, referring to Tennessee teachers as the dumbest people from the dumbest parts of the state who went to the dumbest universities. Like, that is almost a direct quote. Like, I'm not making this up. You can look it up online. It is there. Watch the video for yourself. And Bill Lee didn't push back on him at all about it. In fact, Bill Lee chuckled and they made some jokes and they just kind of moved on in the conversation. Part of this, of course, is they're trying to justify the need for what Hillsdale is arguing they're going to bring to the state versus what currently exists, which is our public education system. Now, fortunately, and I will give plenty of our Republican legislators credit, because many of them were outraged when all of this leaked, including the chair of the Education Committee. I should say the chairs of the Education Committee in both the State House and Senate were very incensed by the whole thing. Because again, these are their constituents. Like, you're bashing them. I mean, we do have several former teachers serving in the state legislature as well. And for the governor to sit there and let this guy just badmouth our teachers, our education system. Like, look, Tennessee has problems for our public education. It's severely underfunded. We could be doing much better. But to, resort to that just sort of rote name calling as our teachers being the dumbest people from the dumbest parts of the state, I think it was quite shocking. And it was definitely something that a lot of our elected legislators were not going to let slide. Sure, some of them,
I'm really curious about digging in on that, because when I know about Tennessee, right, my mom grew up largely in Kingston and East Tennessee in Appalachia. So, I think what's interesting about that statement is the racial valence is really complicated, because probably maybe Larry Arn meant, the Blacker Party. I don't know what he meant. I can't project racism onto him necessarily.
Yeah.
But let's be fair here and say a lot of times when people mean bad schools, they mean Black schools, which is its own problem of, one, racial bias, and then two, if the way funding is allocated, etc. But Tennessee is really complicated because you have a lot of poverty in West Tennessee around Memphis, which is the state's blackest city, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you also have a lot of poverty in the overwhelmingly white eastern part of the state, yes. Appalachia. Yeah. So when you say dumbest parts, I immediately hear both West and Tennessee is a 3-part state, right? It's famously the 3 stars on the flag, everything, West, Middle, and East. I hear, the black Western Delta is part of the state, and the very white, poor white, what people would call poor white trash east part of the state.
Right, right.
Immediately is what I'm thinking. Oh, this guy's just
Yeah,
bagging on Appalachia and the Delta.
yeah. Yeah, no, I think that was a lot of folks' reaction to it. And again, when unfortunately in a single podcast, I mean, we could spend days and days dissecting and really getting into the weeds on some of this stuff. But you're right. I mean, Tennessee it is very rural, is still very poor in most aspects. And so when we talk about education, especially, statements like that from Arn, I mean, that pretty much sunk, I think, at least short-term Hillsdale. I mean, Bill Lee's plan has not gone through, and many in the legislature said it won't, at least as is, because they're not willing to do it. They were very incensed by the comments, and while they may agree with the idea of school choice and bringing in somebody like Hillsdale, I don't know that Hillsdale is going to work. But it also ties into this idea, too, that, I mean, we could be better funding our public schools. Part of what, as an educator, part of what has never sat right with me about the school choice argument is it's always framed around this idea of parents should be able to send their kids to the good schools. Well, shouldn't all the schools be good? Right? Can't we do better in making them all better? So then there's not the idea that, oh, well, I have to get my kid into this one school, because if that school's only taking 500 students or even 1,000 students, I'm in Montgomery County, we have about 30,000 K-12 students countywide. So if you've got one, really good charter school that everybody wants to send their kids to, but they only take 1,000 kids, what about the other 29,000, right? Shouldn't we be doing better to make improvements on the other schools as well?
Well, I think this gets at something that we can get at here towards the end of the conversation, which is this kind of faux populism and anti-elitism that exists, right? Which is Hillsdale would love to be the kind of Harvard or Stanford type institution for conservative evangelicalism.
Right.
And to sort of supplant those, right? There's there, the idea is not, they don't, I think there are plenty of people who genuinely believe that school choice is a good path. And I'm not casting aspersions on everyone, but I do think there are some people for whom, like, the idea is that everyone shouldn't go to a good school, right? That you actually do want to create tiers, and that they just don't like the current tiers, right? So it's sort of, well,
right.
We want the tiers to serve us more, right? And I think you even see that in sort of the anti-Ivy elitist stuff, which is like, it's really not about not wanting selective institutions or not wanting prestige to be concentrated in two particular places and among particular people and among particular establishment institutions. It's about not liking the ones where it's currently pooled.
Right. Sure.
Right. And so, and Tennessee is an interesting dynamic for that, because it does have so many genuinely powerful conservative religious institutions in the state, right? That can kind of play a part in that, affecting that valence of where the power and prestige and everything is, because and obviously for a place like Tennessee, that's probably not, nobody really wants to cede, right, that either to Memphis, or to the eastern mountainous part of the state.
Right.
So the idea of improving those places is not high on the agenda, right?
You're right. Yeah. Yeah. And it never has been. I mean, and again, this is also a historic trend too. I mean, you go back to Brown and the trying to implement desegregation in the, by the late 50s, 60s into the 70s and 80s. But I mean, you can go back even further. I mean, what's interesting too, I mean, I don't research a lot of voting behavior stuff. There was a great piece that came out last year that was looking at, they were using Louisiana specifically, but looking at black voter, how black voting patterns following the Civil War during Reconstruction surpassed white voter turnout in Louisiana. But then you hit, Plessy, you hit segregation, you hit Jim Crow, end of Reconstruction, and everything drops down to zero. What was interesting in their data, though, as well, was that white voter turnout dropped by about a third also during that time, which, especially when you're talking about the South, and this gets to, I think, some of what you were saying with the dynamics between East and West Tennessee, because a lot of that kind of faux populism or rhetoric gets wrapped up in what we see as more traditional racist ideas that are targeting people of color, but that also targets and impacts a lot of poor white people as well, which for some, again, like they don't really necessarily care, have a problem that you kind of group all those folks together. But it doesn't sit well with others, because then you bring that sort of racial divide in as well. That even though they may be poor, they're still white. So you tend to have some of those strange dynamics at play. For me, I think a lot of the dominant religious institution. I mean, look, Tennessee is always going to have a very dominant, at least for the foreseeable future, very dominant evangelical bend to it. And as you mentioned at the very beginning, right, that's not a bad thing, right? Religion in and of itself is not a bad thing. I know I don't mean to come across through this conversation as kind of trash talking religious views. I'm very happy and think anybody's belief system is fine, religiously speaking. And in a state like Tennessee, those institutions can do a lot in promoting civic health. But for public education, I think there needs to be a balance there for a secular public school system as well, to ensure. See, part of where I run aground with the governor's plan that he was putting forward with Hillsdale was it was essentially taking millions of existing public school dollars and just switching it to Hillsdale, meaning that the existing public school system is losing a bunch of money in exchange for these other schools that, as he was promoting, again, his campaign rhetoric that was going to deliver a conservative evangelical education, which, okay, fine, that's all well and good. And, as a parent, if that's where you want to send your kids, great. Again, I have no problem with that. But the secular public schools should not suffer for creating this, and that's why I said, can we work better on raising it? So, for example, Tennessee, we're ranked third from the bottom on the per capita spent per pupil per school year. So the last figure I saw, we were just over $8,000 a year that the state spends per pupil in the K-12 school system, which in perspectives, the schools at the top when it comes to spending are more than double. Like they're closer to $20,000 a year per student per school year. So, looking at that, I mean, I have a high school student, high school sophomore, and his school is a wreck. I mean, like just in the physical buildings of his school are falling apart. There was the beginning of the school year this year, one entire wing of the school was shut down because of the rains. The roof was leaking. It was all flooded out. In fixing all of that, they had to shut down school for a day or two because they were retarring the roof, and the tar fumes had filled the school so bad that nobody could be indoors. So you go from the physical side of everything falling apart to also then, of course, curriculum, which isn't, that's a whole nother area that Tennessee could use some updating and improvements with as well.
Well, I think the broad place I kind of want to end here is this reflection on something that comes up. I've already mentioned this in other places, that I mentioned this over a year ago when I had Angie Maxwell on, and we talked about this, and then just in the last episode with Stephen. But the Southern politics has just got, even when we talk about the role of religion in civic life, well, a lot of times the role of religion in civic life in other parts of the United States has been quite progressive, or at least amenable to what we might see as a liberal in the freedom, public pluralism sense, not liberal in the democratic right sense.
Right, right.
Um, uh, 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 but in the South, it's not even just religion, it's all the institutions, because I think there's just such a strongly ingrained tradition, right, of soft authoritarianism across the whole region, right? We had slavery, then we had Jim Crow, and today it's not that those things are gone. Racism is still a significant problem in the American South,
Yeah,
but the new area of discrimination that is still kind of like uh, I would say arguably nationally somewhat acceptable more falls in the area of LGBTQ rights. And there you see some of the most aggressive measures being taken again, right,
hmm,
in the South.
yeah,
Because discriminatory policies are just not really foreign to this part of the country. I say that as an Arkansan. I don't say that to say that everyone down here is just willy-nilly looking to discriminate, but we do, I think, have, and all of these issues you've brought up today, I think, highlight that about this kind of tendency to distrust public institutions,
oh, for sure.
right?
On that point, especially.
Yeah, but a combination of distrusting public institutions, but being willing to use state power to also deal with smaller groups that you are afraid of or worried about, right?
Right, right.
So you're not you're this weird juxtaposition of discomfort, right, with public institutions, and at the same time, the state mostly exists as a kind of uh, uh, thing to keep other people out, right? And
Yeah,
I think this is a serious conundrum, right? Because when we talk about these reforms, people always want to point to like, well, we have to fight these laws, we shut these laws, and I'm always just kind of like, or even say we got to bring up voter participation, and my instincts are just you're not really going to make this area of the country change overnight in its culture,
sure,
right? So
sure.
getting back to kind of your some of the meat in your piece about civic health, what do you think are the prospects? What are the kind of pathways that are being developed in Tennessee that have the prospect for cultivating a more robust civic health in the state?
Sure. Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, I totally agree. Historically, the South is all, and not just that it's a kind of authoritarian, it is that very distrust of government. So you do have this strong kind of anti-government or worry about government overreach. So there's always that tendency. I mean, the conversation about education spending is a good example. There's a tendency, so you would trust a private entity, something like Hillsdale, far more than you would the state to deliver on those public goods. At the same time, I will say, and I tried to end the piece this way, as you mentioned, because I didn't want it to be all negative, because again, it's a mixed bag, right? Look, social change is slow. Political change is slow. Social change is really slow, right? When I teach American politics, this is one thing I always tell my students, and we have discussions about is change versus status quo. Getting political change is always easier than social change. At the same time, that doesn't mean that change isn't happening in small ways. And we are seeing that. I mean, look, Tennessee is one of the fastest growing states in the country. Middle Tennessee in particular, if we look at the 2020 census numbers, especially in comparison to the 2010 census, was one of the fastest growing regions in the country. It was the fastest growing region in the state. You're getting a lot of people moving into Tennessee from other parts of the country, especially the coasts. So, and I'm not saying that demographics is destiny by any means, but it does change some of the population. It changes certain things slowly. You're also seeing, I think, some more pushback to a lot more of that extremist side of our politics. And that comes from both conservatives and liberals within the state as well. And you're starting to see more organizing at the local level. One thing again that I tell students, if you're feeling very disheartened about our national politics, what's going on, focus locally. Local politics at the city and county level, people tend to be far more pragmatic. There, you get a far more diverse group of folks, and you can see that there's a lot more common interest there. And when you can work on issues or get things done at the local level, you actually see the fruits of that labor far more than you do nationally. And so, what I've noticed, especially at least since the 2018 election cycle, has been a rise in some local activist organizations, nonprofit groups, recognizing the need to focus on voting rights, to focus on voter turnout and get out the vote efforts. I've been part of a group over the last couple of years, the Tennessee Campus Democracy Network, that's just looking at promoting civic health on the campuses at Tennessee's universities. So, and again, this is not ideological, it's not partisan. It's saying just understand what your role as a citizen in the democracy is, what it is that you can do. And we try to help provide skills and tools and outlets to engage. And so I think we are seeing at least some recognition and growth of that grassroots level civic engagement that had been lacking for some time. Tennessee, look, Nashville had the first counter sit-ins for desegregation in 1960. It's been a while since there's been a stronger turn back toward more grassroots activism in the state, but I think we're starting to see that. And it heartens me in that sense that, again, regardless of partisan affiliation or ideology, it's about engaging with each other in a healthy manner to help our democracy function. And if we can get more in that direction, that's a good thing. And I think the state is inching along in that way.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much. I have a closing question that I ask always, which is,
okay,
because we're focused on these kind of places away from the traditional centers, I'm curious. It can be anything. It can be a museum, a park, a restaurant, whatever it is. But give me a place in Clarksville that if someone makes their way to Clarksville, that they should go see or check out or do.
Okay. That's a great question. I would say Liberty Park is always a good stop if you're coming to Clarksville or through Clarksville. It's right on the river. It's a gorgeous, huge, sprawling park. Plenty to do, walk around, look at the river. You're not that far from downtown, which Clarksville is, the downtown area has been booming. They've been doing all kinds of building down there. There's some great restaurants, a few breweries. So it's seeing some it's becoming far more of a vibrant area. I mean, our population has boomed in Clarksville over the last decade. I include myself, since I've only been here for 4 years. And so, yeah, go to Liberty Park and then make your way downtown and grab something to eat downtown.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Kevin Barron. His piece at our 50 Takes series, which is titled Cultivating Anti-Democratic Tendencies in Tennessee, is up on the Pulaski website. Thank you, Kevin, for being with us, and thank you to everyone for listening. Have a good day.
Thanks, Alan. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.